criminal defense hero Don Hammond. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thanks for having me today.
No, thank you. So Rayshard Brooks, a black man who was stopped for a DUI incident, has wound up dead. Another African-American gentleman killed by a police officer. And as predicted, mayhem ensued. The Wendy's where the incident occurred has been burnt down. What else? The police chief resigned. The cop who shot Brooks has been fired. The cop that was with him has been put on administrative leave. What does it mean to be put on administrative leave? Is that a sign that he has been judged to do something wrong, or does it mean something else?
Well, that just means that the police department is going to conduct their own investigation to determine whether they think he did anything wrong in the situation. And that can last, anywhere from a couple of weeks to, I've seen officers on administrative leave for a year or more while the department figures out what to do with them. I would expect in this situation that officer will be cleared of any wrongdoing and let back out onto the force rather quickly.
Right. So it's just kind of a standard operating procedure when something like this has happened. It shouldn't be interpreted as regardless of what the public thinks, it shouldn't be interpreted as his superiors think he acted improperly.
No, I wouldn't interpret it that way at all. It's incredibly common across, a lot of police departments to put somebody on administrative leave following any use of force till they figure out, what went down, why it happened that way, see if there's an opportunity for retraining, and then get them back out there.
All right, so let's turn our attention to what happened. We have, fortunately, when we have you're not only a criminal defense hero, one of your areas of expertise happens to be in DUI defense. So we should get into a little bit of that, too, in a few minutes. But let's start with what's most important, which was the attempted arrest, the fleeing, and the shooting. Let's take a look.
I'm ready to go.
So you had about 1.5 drinks. You don't remember what kind of drinks they were?
No, sir.
All right.
I really don't, Mr. All
right. I think you've had too much to drink to be driving. Put your hands behind your back for me. Here, put your hands behind your back. Hey, stop fighting. Stop fighting. Stop fighting. Stop fighting. You're going to get tased. You're going to get tased. Stop.
Mr. Ross.
Stop.
Come on, man.
Stop. You're going to get tased.
Mr. Ross.
Hey, hands off the fucking taser. Hands off the taser. Stop fighting. Hands off the taser.
So there are blue lights on the left side of the screen. You will see a man run to the right with two police officers chasing him. It appears that the fleeing man turns. You even see a small flash that may or may not be the taser firing. And then it ends very quickly with the man mortally wounded from a police gunshot. This video or portions of it are available also on 11alive.com. Reynolds says that the video will be digitally enhanced and then turn over as part of an investigative package to the Fulton County District Attorney for steps that agency may want to take in this case.
So that's two pieces of footage put together. The first is from the body cam of one of the officers, and then the second part is surveillance footage, I think, from Wendy's. And there were several minutes of interrogation about Brooks being drunk before then. So, Don, why don't you set up what was relevant that happened before that? And we'll actually show some of that footage later on, but just briefly mention how that situation set up, and then let's talk about the actual arrest and shooting.
Sure. This whole situation came about because Mr. Brooks was sitting in the Wendy's drive-through line. I think that he fell asleep there and cars were going around him. So my bet is that somebody called the police and said, hey, there's somebody apparently in need of medical assistance in the Wendy's drive-through line. So the first officer shows up and encounters Mr. Brooks, knocks on the window, wakes him up. After some effort, he didn't just wake up and pop to life right away. He was sleeping pretty soundly there. That officer smells an odor of alcohol, calls in a second officer who I'm guessing has more expertise in DUIs, has taken more of the 7 classes that officers can take in that area. And so that's when this other officer comes in, who ends up being the star of the show at the end.
And his name is, you mean the officer who shot him? Is that what you mean by the star?
Rolfe?
Yeah, Garrett Rolfe is the guy who shot him, and he was fired, and Devin Bronson is the cop put on administrative leave. So go ahead.
Right. So Bronson is first on scene, encounters Mr. Brooks, determines that a DUI investigation is probably appropriate. There's actually one version of the video of video footage where we can see Bronson actually debating, like, do I want to get into the middle of this right now? Because before Officer Rolfe even arrived, Officer Bronson had Mr. Brooks pull his car off to the side and park it into a parking spot. Now, that could have been the end of the encounter right there. There's no threat. The guy's in a safe spot. Take his keys, whatever, park his car safely, tow the car if you want to. But this doesn't have to go any further than that.
All right. Well, hold it right there, Don. What is the law, though? And I have very mixed feelings about this. I used to be a traffic school instructor, actually, so I have a little bit of expertise as it pertains to California law. And unless the law has changed in California, I know that back when I was a traffic school instructor, it was actually against the law to be intoxicated inside the car if you were interpreted to be, I think the phrase was, in control of the vehicle. So I guess if you were in the driver's seat, that was the way they interpreted it. And I have mixed feelings about that because, somebody's avoiding danger by pulling over when they're in that situation. On the other hand, the argument could be made, well, they had to have driven some amount when they were drunk, or else they wouldn't even be there. So what is the law there where it happened, do you know?
I don't know Atlanta or Georgia law on the topic, but in California is an operation state, which means you have to actually operate the vehicle while under the influence for it to be a crime. And the cases define that as volitional movement. So if you get into your car drunk and you're sitting there listening to the radio and sobering up, you're probably okay legally. They're going to have to prove at what time you actually drove. Now, Mr. Brooks is sitting in a drive-through, line is blocking traffic. Obviously, he drove there at some point. That surveillance camera on the Wendy's could conclusively satisfy, figure out exactly when he drove. And then you could do what they call a retrograde extrapolation, which I think is bunk science, but the government would do it anyway, to determine what his blood alcohol might have been at the time of driving versus at the time of any test. Now, in this situation, he's sitting there blocking traffic. The officer actually directs him to move his car. So he drives at the officer's instruction, which is another interesting issue as to whether that counts as, if you're obeying lawful orders by a police officer, can that be used against me to say that I'm, driving under the influence?
Not for that exact moment, right.
But yeah, he probably drove after he says he had 1.5 margaritas. There's one version of the body cam footage where I can see on the preliminary alcohol screening test, he blew a .108. Those things are used primarily just to show presence of alcohol. Certainly states differ as to what the utility of that number is, but a 108 is certainly over the 08 legal limit. And that's the best evidence that we have right now as to, he shouldn't have been driving, probably.
Right. And like you said, he was in the drive-through lane, so that's not a good sign. If you're so drunk that you can't figure out how to get a few feet away from the drive-through lane, then you're probably too drunk to drive. But anyway,
we have a comment here, Jeff, from Paul Myers saying the surveillance footage is lost because Wendy's was torched. So I've certainly seen some surveillance footage from the Wendy's. So that is a thing that certainly, some of it exists. I don't know how much of it would be backed up off-site. That would certainly be best practice to back up any surveillance footage to off-site. So I'm not sure it's all lost, and I've seen some of it.
Well, yeah, I think the footage that we showed came from Wendy's, didn't it?
Yes, the footage of the terminal event came from a Wendy's surveillance camera, and I've seen some from earlier in the night also.
Julia Burdick has a sister with a drinking problem. I'm sure she appreciates you promoting that, Julia. Where were we?
Well, we were talking about that DUI investigation. It looks by all accounts to be a pretty standard DUI investigation from the body camera, dash camera, and Wendy's footage that I've seen there.
Right.
Officer Rolfe is doing a professional job. He does a horizontal gaze nystagmus test. He does a walk and turn. That's at least 2 of the 3, NHTSA standardized field sobriety tests. He appears to be doing a pretty reasonable DUI investigation. They have a decent conversation between them. And
okay, so
he was drunk. It gets ugly.
He was drunk. The cop says, I'm going to arrest you. He attempts to put handcuffs on him. Brooks resists. They struggle. Brooks runs away, taking the officer's taser gun. And it looks like he fired the taser gun at the officer. And then the officer responded by shooting him fatally. Was that a lawful shooting by the officer?
I'm going to say no, but I think it's very close to the border. And the fact that he lost his job over it, that might be appropriate. I'm going to say that he doesn't get convicted of murder or any kind of a homicide on that.
All right. So you just jumped to your conclusion. Back up and give us the factors that are relevant. What should we consider?
So, an officer can meet force with a superior level of force. This guy took his taser, fired the taser at him. If that's all we have and we have a one-on-one situation, I think it's a good shoot. Because if this guy's able to hit the officer with the taser, the next thing he can do is come take the officer's gun and kill him. And so that is a life-threatening situation. The factor in my mind that makes this different is that there are other officers on scene. There's at least one other officer there who would stop that lethal event from happening. Where Brooks takes a shot with the taser and then turns around to keep running, I don't think you can shoot there. But I think it's very difficult to second guess that split second, life-threatening decision. You're told in the academy in no uncertain terms. For one thing, you're told don't let him get your weapons. That's number one. Do not let a suspect ever get your weapons. But once somebody has your weapon and they fire it at you, you've got a good shoot. It's a good shoot, and it's a tough situation.
Paul Myers said it's a kosher shot, because they fired him. Now, you're saying it definitely would be okay if it weren't for there being other cops on the scene, and you're saying maybe because there were other cops, that's what possibly changes the equation.
I think that's absolutely relevant, and I think it's the tipping point. But it's still a really tough situation in that split second for him to factor in what they call the totality of the circumstances.
Right.
Think about, well, who else is on scene? What position are they in? Are they going to be able to save my life if I get hit with this taser and this guy comes to get my gun? That's a lot to process in that split second. I think that ultimately he shouldn't have pulled the trigger. I do not begrudge him dropping his taser and pulling out his gun. But at the point where Brooks is now turning around and running away from him, you've got to have the trigger discipline to not fire at that point, especially when you have backup on scene. One thing that's missing from the body cam footage that I've seen is that nobody seemed to have called for backup. As soon as they went to the ground in that fight, one of those officers needed to be on the radio calling for additional backup. And that didn't happen either. So there's a tactical problem there.
Really? Now, you heard all the radio communications? That's how you know that nobody called?
Well, I can see and hear based on the body camera that's been released. I did not see anybody talking into a radio. I didn't hear anybody, calling for additional backup. There's one version that I've seen that is the dashboard camera from one of the police vehicles that was on scene. And it's tough to, I have not heard anything where somebody's actually calling for backup once the force incident gets started. So that's a problem, but that's minor in the scheme of things. I think the problem here begins with that we as a society need to think about the types of laws that we're passing and the powers that we're giving to law enforcement from the beginning. This incident very clearly drives home the point that any encounter with law enforcement can turn fatal. And I think that we need to look very carefully at what we're doing as a society with law enforcement and what we're expecting of our officers on the street. This didn't need to turn into what it did.
Well, we have two questions from Adrian Vivas, whose name I might be mispronouncing. I'm sorry. Adrian, right. I remember from a previous podcast. I don't know if that's the right way to say it or you just have an attitude when you say it. Adrian. So one question is, he's asking if anyone mentioned where the third bullet went, and it hit a bystander's car that had children in it. You know anything about what Adrian is saying?
I do not know about that, but it certainly is feasible. I think I've seen reports that 2 bullets had actually hit Mr. Brooks, and the third one would be a stray bullet. It's another question of trigger discipline for the officer.
Yes. So you're against stray bullets hitting children. Is that, am I reading?
I am anti-stray bullets hitting children.
You went out on a limb there, Don. If the second cop stopped aiding arrest to call for backup, primary cop could have been injured or killed.
Calling for backup is as easy as pushing a button on their radio that puts out a 999 signal. Cops are hesitant to do that because it is going to call in the cavalry, and they don't want to admit that they're overwhelmed when they're already 2 against 1. So what I would have expected to see during the fight was a click of a mic, back up to the Wendy's or back up at our location. That's all it would take.
Okay. And so we got some body cam footage, some of which we showed here, and there's other body cam footage. In a previous podcast, we talked about your belief that, and I agreed, that all officers should be required to wear body cams whenever they're interacting with the public anywhere in America. And there's been a lot of talk about police reform in recent days. And in fact, today, President Trump issued an executive order. And one of the, I don't think he mentioned body cams, but let's go through his suggestions. He called for certification and credentialing, and that would be based on policies and training regarding the use of force and de-escalation techniques. Your thoughts on that, Don?
I think those are a great start, and those are things that departments should already be doing. And if they're not, then apparently they're going to. The point of this evaluation would be to take away some federal funding from agencies that don't have that type of training. I suspect every major department in the country certainly is going to say, "Yeah, we already have that. We're good here," and it'll be up to an auditing agency to determine, whether that's what they have in place is sufficient.
Well, you just alluded to one of my questions, which is, in general, is this whole ball of wax more a federal issue or more a local issue? You mentioned that, Trump could use leverage as it relates to federal funding. But isn't it more or less a local issue just as far as the law goes when it comes to these kind of things?
It is primarily a local issue. The president to some extent has control over the budget, but really the power of the purse belongs with Congress. So it's kind of an interesting thing that, the executive order is very narrowly circumscribed in terms of what it's actually asking to happen. It's saying that Attorney General Barr should divert, it was discretionary grant funds away from departments that can't meet these certification standards. There may very well be departments that say, we don't need your discretionary grant funds, go pound sand.
Right. Aside from, who has what authority, we can talk about whether or not these are ideas that are good ideas.
Absolutely.
So another thing that Trump called for was prohibiting a chokehold, except where deadly force is allowed by law. So can you talk about that qualifier there and how you feel about it?
Sure. I mean, the only situation where a chokehold could be allowed by law, I think, would be where there's a situation where deadly force would be authorized. If you're in a situation where, you're in a one-on-one fight and you're, his life or yours, and you've got to use a chokehold to stay alive, then that's going to be, authorized. You're authorized to use deadly force at that point. You can't get to your gun because you're in the middle of the fight, so you're going to use a chokehold as deadly force. Anything short of that, a chokehold is entirely inappropriate in law enforcement. My problem with the way that the executive order is worded is that it says any chokehold that cuts off the airflow, but it doesn't talk about a carotid chokehold, which would cut off blood flow to the brain, and that's just as dangerous. And that's what we saw a few weeks ago in the other case.
Right.
We need to address both issues.
Yeah. So my question was going to be, is there some uniform definition that everybody agrees is a chokehold? I have the feeling it's ambiguous, that term.
Well, the way that the executive order defines it, it says, a chokehold that cuts off airflow. And there is also widely recognized within, use of force and martial arts circles that there is a carotid chokehold, and that would cut off blood flow. So if he had not defined it, I would assume that it applied to all types of chokeholds. He did define it to only apply to the type of chokehold that cuts off airflow, and I think that that's a problem.
All right. So the most famous chokehold incident is when Eric Garner in New York was succumbed following a stop in which he supposedly was selling cigarettes, and he resisted, and the cop did what has been referred to as a chokehold around him. But and I don't mean to argue that this was good policing or laudable in any way, but I think this is a point worth making. I want to ask you about it. I think I might have even talked to you about this before. Eric Garner had an enormous chest. I mean, just enormous. And it seems to me you could have one rule for when a suspect is compliant, but if this person is resisting, you may not be able to do what you would want the cop to do. And to my eyes, it looked like this cop would have had a very difficult time getting his arms around Garner's chest because it was so large. And the arm would naturally gravitate towards at least the uppermost part of the chest, if not the neck. So let's just take a look at that footage and then let me know if you think I'm onto something here.
This was the moment in July 2014 when veteran officer Daniel Pantaleo, seen in the green t-shirt, administered a chokehold on Eric Garner that Commissioner James O'Neill said cost Pantaleo his job.
Officer Pantaleo's use of a prohibited chokehold was reckless and constituted a gross deviation from the standard of conduct established for a New York City police officer.
Pantaleo was attempting to arrest Garner for selling illegal cigarettes outside a Staten Island store. During the altercation, Garner screamed, "I can't breathe," 11 times. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. He then suffered an asthma attack and died.
So you see, I mean, his chest and his stomach are pretty big, the circumference there. And that doesn't mean that they handled it the right way. But do you agree there should be maybe a different standard for when a suspect is resisting as opposed to when the suspect is compliant?
Well, if there's no resisting, then there's no need for any amount of force at all. When there's resistance, then an officer can use the amount of force required to overcome the resistance. In that situation, the officer's reaching around and trying to get a hold on the guy. He is a big guy, and the officer's kind of along for the ride as they go down to the ground. I'm not sure that was really even an intentional chokehold at the beginning, but once the officer realized that he had him in a chokehold, especially once they're on the ground there, he needed to let go a lot sooner and say, "Hey, whoa, my bad. I didn't mean to have that maneuver. It is a prohibited maneuver. It's not something that I'm trained to do. It's not within policy of my department." And, I tried to grab him around the chest and I slipped. Works for 3 seconds. It doesn't work for 4 minutes.
What would be the better way of restraining a guy like Garner who's behaving, who's built that way and is behaving that way?
Well, you have multiple officers on the scene. There are control holds that would be effective there if people are appropriately trained to use them. And I'm mostly a big fan of back away from the guy who's flailing and causing danger to officers. You have an overwhelming show of force there, not just with multiple officers, but with what's available on your belts. That's a taser situation. Back away, pull a taser, and threaten him with that. And if he doesn't respond and he's not going to comply, hit him with a taser. There are less lethal ways of handling these situations than a chokehold, which is lethal force. this guy wasn't doing anything to threaten the police officers, and so lethal force would not be authorized. So a chokehold is not in the playbook.
Yeah, and it's not like Garner looked like he was a fleet-footed gentleman who could have ran away anyway.
I think they would have caught him pretty easily.
Yeah, exactly. So another suggestion or order, whatever the wording is in this Trump executive order, is for a national database. That would be to share information about excessive use of force. Is that a good idea?
I think it is, depending on how that database is used. And there are certainly some suggestions in the executive order as to how that gets used. I think it is a good idea to prevent cops who get fired by one department for misconduct from just going to some other department and getting hired. I know last week I saw an invitation from some union leader in Florida inviting the St. Louis and New York cops who had resigned or partially resigned, inviting them to come on down to Florida where we respect police and will gladly hire you. That's not a good look. And it's really a difficult situation when one department is so willing to hire those who have been ostracized from another department, especially because of misconduct and use of force issues. So having that kind of a database would be very useful for that. And it would be useful for defense attorneys to be able to see, well, what's this officer's history? It's very difficult for me right now to get into an officer's personnel file. I have a case open right now where the prosecutor has told me there's PITCUS information in this officer's file, but I can't tell you what it is. Under Brady, they've gotten to the point where they believe they need to tell me that there's something there, but now I have to file a motion and convince a judge that I should be allowed to see what's there and that it's relevant to my case. These kinds of things, when there is misconduct and there are problems in an officer's file, whether it's from some other department or from his current department, those kinds of things should be common knowledge in the defense community, and they should be out. I should be able to make the determination as to whether it's relevant to my current case. Not a prosecutor first deciding to tell me, and then I have to go convince a judge.
Well, that not only makes a lot of sense, as you say, it just seems very doable too. Certain ideas, you hear it, you go, okay, that makes sense, but how's it going to get done? That sounds like it can get done. Trump also called for additional training as it relates to mental health, homelessness, and addiction issues. And I'm a little fuzzy as far as when things changed, but I think we all know that homelessness has gotten much worse in recent years. And it occurs to me that probably a lot of police officers went into that line of work to do something different than what they have been forced to do in recent years. And I don't know how much training they have or don't have, but it's pretty clear that at least in some cities, they spend a lot of time dealing with these kinds of issues. Are they properly trained? And, is there a lot of room for improvement?
They certainly are not properly trained to deal with a wide range of issues that we've somehow decided as a society are going to be policing issues. Mental health issues, police are grossly undertrained in being able to deal with those issues. They're not social workers. They don't have master's degrees in therapy or mental health conditions. It's a very difficult situation that we're putting officers in to respond to those things, and finding ways to either train the officers better, which is difficult. I mean, I believe in specialization in trade as an economic principle, that, people should use their skills and build up their skills as much as they can in their specialized area, and then, do their job, not somebody else's job. I commonly tell people I want to be a lawyer, not a banker. I don't want a long payment plan or things like that. There are other disciplines that are better suited to dealing with mental health issues. Now, those issues can turn violent. So it's a very complicated issue in terms of sending the appropriate amount of protection with a mental health worker, identifying the issue in the first place as a mental health issue, that triage step, that's where we're going to have a lot of debate and a lot of consternation as to how do we deal with that and how do we keep everybody safe without increasing the police's role or even maintaining at its present level. That's going to be a very difficult problem to solve. But I like the direction of the conversation to at least recognize that we're asking too much of our officers in a lot of circumstances, and that there should be a better team approach coming into a scene to try to de-escalate and deal with the situation.
Yeah, because as you were going on about that, I was saying to myself, so what does Don want, think should happen? And you're not sure, and that's a legitimate position. And you're saying that it's a good direction to go in, and it's what we should be exploring. But let's think for a moment what the options are here. I guess the two main options that come to mind would be to give the police additional training, and the other would be maybe to have people who are mental health professionals accompany the police on calls. Would you any thoughts?
I think getting more people involved in the situation is probably appropriate. One other thing that could be helpful is more of an English model where a lot of line level police officers aren't armed. They're less likely to shoot somebody if they're not carrying a gun. And if a situation is escalating, then maybe you call in, the next level of force to help deal with that situation. I mean, we can spitball ideas all day long about different methods of implementation, and ultimately that's clearly the conversation that we need to have as to bringing in the right professionals, having the right amounts of force on scene. When we see during recent protests and riots, cops are coming in with less lethal options. They're coming in with rubber bullets. They're coming in with pepper balls, things like that. Your average street cop doesn't have that.
Actually, in some cases, they're not coming in at all. They're surrendering and fleeing. That can't be good.
That's also a valid tactic in some circumstances. And that's actually what I would advocate for vis-a-vis a lot of our low-level crimes in the first place. There was no reason to arrest. I mean, sure, Mr. Brooks probably drove drunk and probably broke the law.
Yeah.
But was he endangering anybody at that point? Who's the victim here? Why did this situation turn into an arrest that availed itself of an opportunity for a use of force to create this whole problem? Cite him out for the DUI. Take his keys. There are all kinds of things that we can do to improve policing to de-escalate these situations, and not just de-escalate them, but prevent the escalation in the first place. So we don't even need to get to de-escalation.
Right. Well, to what extent does it happen in America, if at all? I don't even know if it happens at all, that in a DUI situation, they don't arrest the person and bring them in. They just cite them, like issuing a ticket, I guess is what you're talking about. Does that happen at all?
It's very rare nowadays. It used to be much more common that on a DUI stop, police would escort somebody home or give them a ride home, lock the keys in their car, call somebody to pick them up. Those kinds of things used to happen very frequently. Now it's very rare. Well, for one, when they do happen, I don't hear about them because people aren't clamoring to my office to say they were given a ride home.
Those are sort of two extremes. I'm wondering about the happy middle, meaning, one is to arrest the person and bring them in. The other is, you were just talking about, basically letting them off the hook. But what about citing them? They're not being let off the hook. They're just, not arresting.
That would require some changes to our implied consent laws and the way that we do chemical testing. There are portable alcohol screening devices that are on the conforming products list that can be used in court. And if more departments were using those, of course, defense attorneys would pick them apart in the field. But the way that it is right now, you have to make the arrest because the arrest triggers the implied consent test. Somebody has to choose blood or breath. And then we're either going to take them to the station to do a breathalyzer on a more sophisticated machine, or we're going to take them to a place where they can do a blood draw. Now, there are departments that have phlebotomists on staff or contracts with phlebotomists. There are departments that have police officers that are trained to be phlebotomists to do a blood draw. So they can sit them down, do a blood draw in the field, and send them on his merry way with a citation and instructions not to drive that night. Or, and there are a variety of ways that we can do that. Currently, no. A cop makes an arrest for DUI. They smell alcohol, pass the person out of the vehicle. Right at that point, there's a 95% chance that person's going to jail that night, regardless of any field sobriety tests, what the PAS says, anything else. They're going to jail. And I'm not sure that's appropriate for every circumstance.
All right, there was one other suggestion that Trump made in his executive order, and that's to enhance community engagement. And I'm not entirely sure if that means the police, what the police do while they're on the job, or does it mean, off the job they, find ways to, do things on their own time, or maybe it means both? What do you think?
I think it has more to do with on the job, the way that policing is done, and building relationships in the community to build trust with our uniformed officers. And there are departments that are doing a very good job of this. I'm not sure they're doing a very good job, but I know that for a fact that LAPD has some community engagement programs. They sponsor things like Friday Night Lights that gets, sets up basketball games for youth on Friday nights through the summer season. They have officers, including my brother is actually assigned to a special unit of LAPD in Watts, where he's in a housing project, keeping the peace and getting information, but building relationships with the people on the ground so the police department can keep a better tab on what's happening there. But he's also building those relationships and building respect so that people don't run when they see him walking down the street in their project. They say, "Hey, officer, well, how's it going?" Because they know that he's not out there trying to catch them on every little thing. I mean, he's going to respond if something big happens, but he's not worried about the 17-year-old smoking a cigarette on the corner. That's the kind of nonsense like Eric Garner was trying to, he's selling illegal cigarettes and this results in a use of force with a guy dead. I mean, that's just bonkers from the start of the way that we're doing policing.
Right. And to this day, I haven't even heard who the person was who claims Garner was selling these cigarettes. And to me, that's a rather important issue because that's what would determine whether or not it was even lawful to detain him. I saw something on your Facebook page today, I think it was, saying that if the stop isn't lawful, then it's not against the law to resist. Am I paraphrasing it correctly?
It's not illegal to resist an unlawful arrest. And that was out of a California Court of Appeals case that was released on Thursday.
Right. So if it's not illegal to resist, then there should be some focus on what justified the detention of Garner. All the news stories.
Well, we had that situation with George Floyd, too. I mean, the police were called to the scene over a supposedly counterfeit $20 bill. I haven't seen a picture of the $20 bill either. But, that is not a situation that should result in a loss of life.
There's no mystery there.
An arrest, let alone a loss of life.
There's no mystery in that case, though. It was somebody who worked at the store who called the police. So at least that information is out. I've never seen any information about any member of the public calling the police about Garner or any police officer being the one who witnessed it or anything about who was the buyer of these cigarettes. It's just mind-boggling to me. So that's all of the suggestions that Trump made. But there's also talk in various circles about other police reform ideas, including doing away with qualified immunity. What is qualified immunity, and what do you think about it?
So qualified immunity applies when an officer is doing something in the scope of his duties, and there's an injury or something. It basically says you can't sue that officer civilly. It's not a criminal issue. It's all about civil liability and recovery against the officer individually. If there's a civil rights violation, you can often go after the department. If it's really egregious conduct outside the scope of his duties, there are ways to get around the immunity and go after the officer individually. But that movement would be to take away that qualified immunity so that basically anybody who thinks that they've been beat up by the cops or treated unfairly can sue the individual officer and recover against both the department and the officer.
And so you want to strike a balance, obviously. On one hand, you can't make the police afraid to do their jobs. On the other hand, if they go overboard, it would be nice that they face some punishment, and the fact that they might would be a nice deterrent. So where do you stand? Do you think that the balance is already struck appropriately, or do you think it needs to be changed somehow?
I think there's room for some movement on that issue. I think that as it is, police have a little bit too much protection and they feel too cozy. We want to make sure we're encouraging the right kind of people to get into law enforcement. And when you're telling prospective cops that that you're never personally going to be on the line no matter what you do, that might encourage the wrong kind of person to apply for that job. If there's a little bit of fear of, wow, if I screw this up, my own assets, my family could be on the line. Of course, what's going to happen here is you're going to develop an insurance market, and then it becomes a question of who pays the insurance premiums, whether the officer does or the department does, and that's a whole rabbit hole that that's going to get explored over the next months and years.
Paul Myers is saying that it was the store owner who objected to these cigarettes. And I have a question for Paul Myers. Did you actually see specifically that the store owner had called the police right before that incident? In other words, if he had done it in the past, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, Don, that would not be reasonable suspicion. The police can't just be detaining people because they have bad reputations. It has to be a reason to respond at that time. So, Don, am I correct about that? And Paul is saying, yes, you saw in the news that it was the store owner who called right before that incident. I never saw that. I'll take your word for it.
So yes, you are correct that the officers have to have, a suspicion that something's going on in that moment. Certainly, in California, I'm aware of the penal code sections that say, if it's a misdemeanor arrest, you either need a warrant or it has to have happened in the officer's presence. You have some suspicion that something happened, and then, because he's done it the 3 days prior, now you're going to come up and arrest him for it today. I mean, you could send in an undercover officer or something to do a sale, and now it's happened in the officer's presence. You can go make the misdemeanor arrest.
Right. But you can't just go up to somebody because they have a bad reputation and hassle them. All right. So,
no,
Paul,
and you can't cite me today for a stoplight that I ran 3 days ago either.
Do you know Paul Myers by any chance?
I do not.
Oh, okay. I want to know how reliable this information is, but I appreciate the response. He's saying that Garner set up shop there frequently, and that's what I saw. But what I never could find was anything mentioned in a news story about the store owner or anybody having called the police right before that incident. No-knock warrants. My hero. Some folks think that that should be done away with. Your thoughts?
No-knock warrants are generally a very bad idea, except in the most dire of circumstances where there's a real fear of danger if there's any kind of notice. The Breonna Taylor situation, that should have been a simple. We've got a warrant. We know that one person lives here. Set up surveillance. Oh, there goes her boyfriend into the house. Let's wait for both of them to leave and then go serve a warrant and search the place and do what we need to do and wait for her to come home and make an arrest if it's appropriate. Busting down somebody's door at 3 a.m. puts everybody in danger. It puts the occupants in danger. It puts the police in danger. It's a really bad situation for everybody. Especially when you've already got your prime suspect in custody and you're conducting follow-up investigation. That's not called for. There may be appropriate situations for a no-knock warrant when you're going to take down a meth lab where everybody's armed and it's never abandoned. And, there's a quantum of circumstances that say, if we give these guys notice, they're going to flush everything and, we're going to lose our evidence and it's going to put more people in danger. I think the use of no-knock warrants has gotten way overblown, and it's used in far too many circumstances, and it ends up putting both the public and the police in way more danger than is necessary for these situations.
Well, is it more because the judges are handing them out too easily, or is it because the police are going in and exaggerating the situation?
I think it's both. Police are trained to write reports in a way that they get what they want from the judges. Judges, I think, they're used to working with the same cops over and over again. They get to a point of complacency where they may rubber stamp some warrants and not really read them as carefully as they should. And judges are the gatekeepers under the Fourth Amendment. That they are the people who are supposed to be protecting the public from police overruns, and they're not doing it as well as they should either. But the police shouldn't be asking for a no-knock warrant when it's in not the appropriate situation. I don't understand what the police motive is to put themselves and the public in more danger than is necessary for a situation. Because you don't want to spend the resources to set up a 6-hour surveillance and see when everybody leaves the place. I mean, how much resources are you putting into the no-knock warrant in the first place, which would be, you'd much more easily get, what you're after without any possibility of violence if you just wait a few hours and set up some surveillance. The problem is, it has multifaceted.
Okay. So if you have any more time, Don, we can take a look at some of the footage when the officer and Rayshard Brooks were going through the DUI testing. Do you have more time, or should we save it for another day?
I think that's interesting to talk about.
Okay, so I have two pieces of footage. We'll break it up a couple of minutes each. And let's start now with the beginning of when the officer is asking Brooks how much he drank and so forth.
I can't blame nothing on her. It was my decision. I said, hey, if she can't get her order together, and I'm not feeling uptight right now, I just park right here. Go to sleep. I'm not feeling, I'm just not feeling right.
What do you mean you're not feeling right?
Do
you think maybe that you had too much to drink and you realized that you shouldn't drive, so you parked?
I mean,
would that be accurate to say?
Yes, sir. Mr. Roth, yes.
All right, so your girlfriend dropped you off, you got into the car,
I
you backed out,
and called her.
And you're like, damn, I'm too drunk to drive. And so you pull back into the parking spot and park, right?
I call her and like, babe.
Is that accurate?
If it's a couple moments I got on the phone with her.
Yeah.
I'm like, babe, hey, damn, you want number one or number two, or?
But
she's like,
would you agree?
You take care of that. You're a man. You figure out what we're going to eat tonight.
All right. Let's move past that. Would you agree that you've had too much to drink to drive?
I mean, I can focus, Mr. Roth. I can focus.
Would you agree that you've had too much to drink to drive?
I haven't had, to the point where I can't focus.
Okay.
I was a little tired ahead of the day because we just came from North Carolina.
Do you think that you're safe to operate a vehicle right
Absolutely,
now?
Mr. Roth.
And how much have you had to drink?
I had 1.5 margaritas, Mr. Roth.
1.5 margaritas?
Yes, sir.
Margaritas?
Yes.
Have you had anything else today? Any other type of drink?
No, sir.
You haven't had any daiquiris?
I haven't had no daiquiri. I had 1.5 little small cups of margarita, but I'm up now. Y'all got me up with this.
Got you up.
I'm up now.
Hey, will you take a preliminary breath test for me?
What's that?
It's a little handheld machine. I have you blow into it, and that lets me know if you're positive or negative for the presence of alcohol in your breath.
I've been drinking.
Okay.
I do say that.
Okay.
But I'm only going a few minutes down the road.
I got you. I'm just asking, will you take a preliminary breath test for me?
I mean, I don't know what it is.
I just said it's a little handheld machine. Lets me know if it's positive or negative for the presence of alcohol. That's part of my investigation.
You know it is the presence.
I know.
Drinking.
I know. I can tell. That's just part of my investigation.
But I said, if I have to park this car right here, right now, and walk,
it's just a yes or no. We don't need to go back and forth about it. It's just a yes or no.
But what if I take this test and I don't care about? I can walk home. I don't have to park.
Why would you walk home?
I just don't want to be in violation of anybody. I can walk. My sister's house is right here.
Do you think?
Was that a typical encounter, and what were the key moments in your judgment?
Sure. I think the officer is following his training. He's asking questions. He's asking leading questions to try to get the guy to admit that he's committed a crime. He's trying to build probable cause for his arrest. I think he probably already has it at this point, but he's trying to get more pre-arrest statements before things like Miranda have to apply, so that he can put these things into his report and parrot them back to a jury and say, well, he admitted that he had too much to drink in order to drive. I'd like to see him with some sort of a form actually recording the answers, but he's got it all on body cam that he can watch later to fill in his report. So that doesn't bother me as much as it would if there were no body cam. My biggest problem with this situation right now really is Mr. Brooks seems to be under the grossly mistaken impression that he's going to be able to talk himself out of an arrest at this point. The best thing he can do is shut the hell up and not stop talking, stop giving them more evidence. Don't do the field sobriety test, which I think he had already done at this point because they're asking for the portable breath test, and don't do the portable breath test either. But he, obviously is unaware of his rights to refuse those things, and he thinks he's going to talk himself out of a bad situation, which isn't going to happen.
Right. My assumption is that's a common tactic for the cop to act friendly so that the person feels comfortable and they're not on the defensive, and they might be more apt to say something incriminating.
Sure, they're having a conversation.
Michael Flynn, actually. Michael Flynn, who's a savvy, very sophisticated person, was lulled into believing it was just a friendly chat.
They're having a peaceful conversation. Everything's going fine there. The officer is not expecting him to be a threat. He's not expecting any violence to come of this. And then, 99.9999% of the time, that encounter happens. The officer reaches for the guy's wrist, puts him in cuffs. They go do a water breath test at the station. The guy's back out on the street in a couple of hours, and everything's fine. This officer at this point in the encounter doesn't have his the hair on the back of his neck raised at all. He's just doing his job. He's very professional, and I approve of what he's doing there.
So you would recommend to clients to shut up, but let's get a little more specific and, account for people feel a little odd saying absolutely nothing at all. So, do you mean literally refuse to talk, or just are there certain things that a person should say to a police officer in a situation like that?
Gee, officer, I'd love to cooperate, but my lawyer would kill me.
And things to that effect.
Yeah, you're going to turn over your license, registration, insurance at the window when he asks for them. What people don't understand is at the point where you're asked to step out of the vehicle for a DUI investigation, and the officer will usually say something like, I just want to make sure you're okay to drive. Why don't you step out and do some tests for me? Step out of the vehicle. Don't resist there. You're going to get your ass dragged out of the vehicle if you don't. But there's no reason to answer any questions about how much you've been drinking, where you've been drinking, where you came from, how long you were driving, when you last slept, when you last ate. All these questions they're going to ask, you don't need to answer.
Okay. So I'm just, trying to put myself in the headspace of somebody who, they're facing an officer. The question is, have you been drinking? And it just seems to me the average person is going to feel like it's kind of the same thing as admitting if they won't answer that question, as opposed to saying no. Why isn't
saying no is fine with me, but now you're lying. Nobody's going to prosecute you for a 148 based on that lie to a peace officer. But I understand that. But, I'd rather have no than I had 2 beers, because every officer hears that every night, multiple times, and they never believe you when you say you had 2 beers, because it's a very common lie.
Right. All right. So you just mentioned nobody would be prosecuted for telling a lie, but that is illegal. So why is nobody ever prosecuted for it? Let's imagine, a very case where the evidence is very strong and somebody is convicted of drunk driving, and they have a recording saying, no, they weren't drinking. Why are they never prosecuted for telling a lie?
Well, for one thing, the consequences of the DUI are going to be far greater than the consequences of the false information to a peace officer on that. So the government has nothing to gain by prosecuting that additional count. You're not going to do any enhanced sentencing based on it. Maybe it's another count on the person's rap sheet on a case that we're going to expunge 3 years later anyway. It just doesn't give them anything as a benefit.
Okay. I just think the whole issue of lying and perjury is a weird issue. It's sort of like this message is sent to society that you can get away with it. And I just think that's
perjury is a different issue. And especially when you're talking about the feds, they will come after you. We've seen many high profile celebrities get prosecuted, and, lying to the feds is the charge that gets them, rather than whatever the underlying investigation was about. That happens frequently in the federal system. In the state system, If you're getting charged with a false information to a peace officer, you've really done. You swatted somebody. You called and reported something to 911 and made a report of something that wasn't actually happening, and that put people's lives in danger. Now they're going to come after you. But during the course of a DUI investigation, saying, "Nah, I didn't have anything to drink," you're not going to get prosecuted for that. But I still don't recommend that. I don't recommend lying to the police. I recommend saying
that's not a good
answer.
That's not a good look for attorneys, whether they're a criminal defense hero or just a normal attorney. It's not a good look to publicly recommend lying. So I'll back you on that one, Hero.
I would rather you just not answer the question.
All right, let's look at the end of the encounter leading up to the arrest, and this footage includes the field sobriety test.
Hold on, Mr. Brooks. Will you take a preliminary breath test for me? It's yes or no.
I don't want to refuse anything.
It's yes or no. It's completely up to you.
Yes, I will.
Okay, just wait here while I grab it.
Oh, man.
So, just trying to make sure, man, you're safe to drive, that's all.
I know, man.
You scared me a little bit because you were sleeping in there, so that's, why I was making sure you're okay. And then that's...
I know. You just doing your job.
All right, just take a deep breath in. Put your mouth over the mouthpiece. Blow as hard as you can until I tell you to stop. Blah, 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 blah. Stop. Very good.
I just had a few drinks. That's it.
How many?
1.5. Like I said, I was into the second cup. I told her, babe, let's go because I'm hungry.
What kind of drinks did you have?
I'm not sure. It's something she ordered. She said top shelf or whatever.
Top shelf what?
I'm not sure. It was, like I said, it was her birthday and it was my daughter's birthday intent to, have a good time. And I said, babe, I'm hungry. Let's go. My baby's mom, she was there. I said, babe, go ahead. I'm cool. Here's the money for the blow-up bed tomorrow. Here's the money for, to enjoy herself tomorrow. Just, give me a burger or something. Just take me home. I'm ready to go.
So you had about 1.5 drinks, but you don't remember what kind of drinks they were?
No, sir.
All right.
I really don't, Mr. All
right. I think you've had too much to drink to be driving. Put your hands behind your back for me. Here, put your hands behind your back. Hey, stop fighting. You're gonna get tased.
Stop, Mr. Ross.
Stop.
Come on, man.
Stop. You're gonna get tased.
Mr. Ross.
Hands off the fucking taser. Hands off the taser. Stop fighting. Hands off the taser.
Oh, they were getting along so well. I like how he calls him Mr. Rolfe while they're struggling.
Sure, he still thinks he's going to talk his way out of it. Even while they're on the ground rolling about, Mr. Rolfe, let me talk to you. Let's work this out. You don't have to do this. That's not the direction that's going at that point.
So I thank you for that nice compliment, Paul, and thank you for your participation. So I take it you would not recommend submitting to a field sobriety test either. Is that correct?
No. So what we saw there is actually what they call the portable alcohol screening device, which is used as a field sobriety test. There are other videos out there of them doing a horizontal gaze nystagmus test, which is the follow the finger or follow the pen type thing with your eyes only. And there's a video I saw of doing a walk and turn. We take 9 steps out, do a turn the way they specify, 9 steps back, the heel to toe, walking the line type thing that people are familiar with. So those things are out there as well. And you shouldn't do any of those things. There's no reason to do any of them. All you're doing is giving them more evidence. I've done field sobriety test demonstrations with community groups of completely sober people, brought up completely sober people, put them through field sobriety tests, and they very often fail. So there's no reason to attempt to do after a drink the things you can't even do sober. Because the police are going to take every clue that you exhibit as an indication that you're under the influence, not anything else.
So I think you just answered my next question, which is even if you're stone cold sober, your recommendation would be to refuse to take the test.
I don't know if you've been drinking today, Jeff. It looks like you haven't, but my bet is I could rack up a couple of clues on field sobriety tests on you right now.
But aren't you now in the uncomfortable, or maybe not uncomfortable, position of recommending that people break the law? Because at least in California, are you not required to take a field sobriety test?
You're absolutely not required to do field sobriety tests. You can decline to answer questions. You can decline to follow the pen. You can decline the roadside gymnastics. Do not walk the line. Do not stand on one leg. Do not count your fingers. Do not say the alphabet backwards. Do not put your head back, close your eyes, and estimate 30 seconds. You're not required to do any of these things. You are not required to blow into that portable alcohol screening device that we saw there, or any other version of it, like the Alka Sensor 4 that I have in my office.
Have I misinterpreted what used to be known as the implied consent law, or has that law been abolished?
Implied consent is for a chemical test after arrest. So after those little silver bracelets go on, where are mine? Here we go. Once these little bad boys go on, then it's time to start cooperating. Then you agree to do a blood test or a breath test only. And only one of them. You do not refuse. Well, then that's exactly right. Paul has something right down here too. That if you refuse a chemical test in California, you will likely lose your license for a year. A hard suspension, no restricted, no ignition interlock, no nonsense. You will not drive for a year if you refuse the chemical test, which is the implied consent test, which is the blood or breath test after arrest. So there's no reason to do anything up to that point. If the officer has probable cause to make the arrest, then you can choose blood or breath. I usually prefer blood, but I have to caveat that because some clients choose blood, which is the only means for the government to find that they're, in addition to alcohol, they've got THC, cocaine, and other stuff in their system. So if you happen to know that you have these other extracurriculars in your system, then go ahead and feel free to choose breath. Otherwise, if you're alcohol only, I like a blood test.
You get excited when we talk about this issue. This is your bailiwick, isn't it?
Day in and day out. You see those white notebooks behind me on that shelf? Those are police training manuals for DUI investigations.
All right. So this isn't your first rodeo. Steve Woolner has a question. Did someone report that when Rayshard Brooks fired the officer's taser at him, that hit bounced off his skull, or is this just an unsubstantiated rumor?
I have not seen that it bounced off his skull. In the aftermath of the incident, on one of the body cameras, I saw him say that he thinks he got hit by it. He felt a tingle, but he didn't say where it would have hit him. So I'm not sure where it hit him. I think the fact that he fired at the officer normally would justify deadly force, but I think there are some other circumstances here that lead to it being a bad shoot, but probably not criminal. And at the risk of pissing a lot of people off, I do not see this as a race-related incident. I think the officer was treating him with respect. The incident was all, it was a fine investigation. He went to arrest the guy, and I don't think the fact that he's black had anything to do with the way this turned out.
All right. Well, let's not let you go any further because this is cancel culture time, and I don't want you to be canceled. If Black Lives Matter finds out that you aren't saying the approved thing, you could be in big trouble.
I support Black Lives Matter in many, many ways, but in this situation, I think it's race card denied.
All right. Well, let's get into that in our next podcast. We're going to talk about Chaz in our next podcast. There's an interesting experiment going on in Seattle. I don't think we have a time, but maybe what's today? Tuesday, maybe Thursday. We can come back. We'll
have some time to do that on Thursday for the Chaz/Chop.
Okay, all that Chaz. All right, Don, take it easy, and thanks. Another enlightening conversation, always interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Have a good one.
Okay, thanks.